Well, I want to welcome you to our online Bible study. Nancy Berger and I are going to be discussing 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. But let me give you just a little bit of background to this before we jump into it. In the book of Acts, chapter 16, which is a marvelous way to kind of follow Paul's ministry and then read his letters that coincide with the different places he travels. So in Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas welcome a new member of their team, Timothy, whose mother is Jewish, whose father was Greek. And so he begins traveling with them, and they plan to go into one area, but it says in verse 7 of that chapter, but the Spirit of Jesus did not permit them. So shortly after this, Paul had a vision of a man in Macedonia, that's a province, calling him to come there. And so they came to Macedonia, and in particular to the city of Philippi. And as it is with much of Paul's ministry, we witness joy and suffering. Lydia was the first European convert. Lorraine and I have been to that spot. Obviously, they didn't mark it with a giant X, but the vicinity, because of the water and the river and all, they have pretty good guesstimation of where this would have been, where Paul and Silas and Timothy would have gone to participate in a time of prayer. And Lydia gave her life to Christ, and they would end up starting a house church in her home. So that's cause for wonderful celebration. She became the first European convert. And then Paul and Silas were imprisoned because Paul had exorcised a demon from a young slave girl who was operating as a psychic for profit for her masters. And because they lost their source of income, they caused legal problems for Paul and Silas and had them beaten and then thrown into jail. So here they are in the innermost part of a jail prison, kind of a cave jail. And but that's when God causes an earthquake, and Paul ends up leading the jailer and his whole family to Christ. So they end up leaving there. And then he goes to Thessalonica. Paul and Silas and Timothy go to Thessalonica and have marvelous ministry out of the synagogue. Many of the Jewish people believe, many of the God-fearing Greeks believe, but some of the Jewish traditionalists weren't fond of what was happening, gathered a mob together, and it was life-threatening. And so Paul and Silas, Timothy, they sent them away to a nearby place called Berea. And at Berea, similar thing happened where they had a great response to the gospel, but some of the people from Thessalonica heard that they were in Berea, and so the mob came to Berea and created problems. So from that point, they sent Paul on to Athens, and Silas and Timothy stayed to kind of help the church get started in Berea. So Paul goes to Athens by himself, and it's there that atop Mars Hill, he endeavors to more philosophically, more intellectually, try to engage in the discussion with the intelligentsia and convince them about Jesus. And when he mentions the resurrection from the dead, one of the things, one of the words it uses is that they sneered at him. They mocked him, and though there were a handful of those that responded to the gospel, for the most part, it's considered, if numbers are a sign of success or failure, it's considered probably Paul's greatest failure. So after this, he goes to Corinth. So that sort of introduces what we're going to be talking about tonight. So here are just a series of rhetorical questions with that as the backdrop to all of this. Question number one is, when we think about Paul enduring the recent beatings, the jail, the mobs, the rejection of the intelligentsia. How do setbacks affect you? This is just a question to think on, not to answer right away, but just to think about. How do setbacks in life affect you? Second question is, when you feel weak within yourself, what is your pattern of response? How do you react or respond to that? Thirdly, when you are discouraged and feeling weak and afraid and shaky, how do you still prove or demonstrate and witness to your faith? So, Nancy, in verse 1, given Paul's recent history, what do you think about when he says that he has not come with eloquence or human wisdom? Why might that be that he has not come with eloquence or human wisdom? Any thoughts on that?
Well, and I think that what he means by that, he has total reliance on God. He doesn't come with human wisdom because he knows God has gotten him through what has happened to him, and he knows that God will continue to get him through these situations. And I think Paul decided that his main goal was to preach the who is Jesus and why is the resurrection important. So he was focused on that simple message. I wonder what's happened. I don't know if I'm on or Richard is on.
Nancy, are you there?
Oh,
there you are. I've never had that happen before.
Well, maybe what I was saying was so profound that the camera couldn't take it.
Oh, there you are. I've never had that happen before.
Now there's an echo. It was so profound that the camera couldn't take it.
Oh, there you are. I've never had that happen before.
Now there's an echo. It was so profound that the camera couldn't take it. Oh,
there you are. Nancy, I've never had that happen before. I'm going to go off and let's both come back on our link again.
Okay.
Are we live?
I'm here. I hear you.
I've never had that happen. That is really weird.
Is that Satan lurking about?
It's a roaring lion. Well, I'm sorry for botching up that answer. Suddenly I was gone. I could see you and hear you. I didn't know how to get back in.
Well, I ended up going out and coming back in too.
Okay. Well, folks, sorry, we are back and we're live and our mouths are matching our sound now. So that's really a good thing. I want to look at this passage, chapter 2, verse 1 says, "And so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God." And so, Nancy, I got enough to know you were responding to that first part as far as eloquence and human wisdom. It struck me that Paul's emphasis then is, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. And I thought a little bit about the difference between teaching and testimony. And they're both important.
Mm-hmm.
But because teaching, we break down things, we give some framework and structure within our belief system. But testimonies are so powerful. When we have some people share on Sunday mornings, and sometimes their testimonies, their witness to what God has done in their lives is just so powerful. And the early church, that's really what it was built around, was tell people what God has done for you. Because they hadn't developed, Paul's letters became the theological framework for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But what is it about testimonies that just resonate so much with people's hearts?
I think they're so authentic. When you give a testimony, it's something that you have lived. And if you have lived something, you're much more eloquent, compassionate, powerful about it, as opposed to just reciting facts or theories or whatever. And I think obviously both are important, but totally different. And I think good teachers actually use testimony.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's true. Yeah, because testimony puts the wind in the sails. You
Yes.
need the sail, but you got to have the wind that fills the sail out. I think testimony it's the passion that testimonies give.
I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that most pastors, when they're starting a sermon, they tell something that's happened to them and then relate it. And that is a kind of testimony.
Right. Yeah, because I think you witness to what God has done for you. Mm-hmm. And again, you say it's authentic, it's genuine, and it's pretty disarming. People, you can have intellectual arguments all day about things, but when someone says, "This happened to me," I mean, you can believe it or not believe it, but it's authentic. This is what happened to the person.
And I think, too, when it's a story, often of redemption, when you start out with something really bad that's happened and kind of weave through how God got you through it, mm-hmm. That is really powerful.
Yeah, it is. It's a powerful thing, and I'm thankful that that's kind of become a little more a part of our church life, is thinking about the testimonies. And I think I hear so many comments, all like when Logan shared testimony, or Nathan, or when Sean gets up and shares.
Or Denise.
Denise. Yeah. Oh, and of course, I was privileged to hear Denise's testimony at the Pool of Bethesda when we were in Louisville. And that was very special when she talked about her healing there at a place that is so symbolic of healing. So,
and I often think we think of testimony being to a group of people, but the reality is testimony just on one-on-one can be very powerful too, when you're just telling your friend.
Yes, very much so. And I think it's something that sometimes people think, oh, I can't witness. And I think some people think that means they have to, have a 3-point message in a poem or something. But a witness is simply, if someone says, I was in the hospital and I just, God's strength just got me through. That's a testimony. That's the witness, because you're simply telling, here's what God did.
And when you think of Paul, think about what powerful testimonies he had.
Boy, I know it. He really did. And of course, the one of his conversion, he tells several times. And again, what are you going to do with that? This is what happened to me. You can reject it or accept it, but this is what God did in my life. And it's, it's yours. You can speak at such a personal level because this happened to me.
Right.
So I love the power of testimony. In fact, it's Revelation 12:11, I think, that says we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, and then verse 2, Paul says, "For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." I resolved, he says. And I wanted to look here. The Greek word for resolved means to come to a choice, to judge, or to make a determination. And I wonder how much Paul's experience in Athens, where he's with a group of philosophers, and these people gather and do this for sport, like other people play golf. And it wasn't terribly successful, in at least from a numbers standpoint. And it makes me wonder how much that affected his judgment or determination to just center on Jesus Christ and Him crucified. You think?
I think that because Paul obviously is a human being, all of the things that happened to him had to have an effect on him. But I think the effect on him, whereas if I went through even a small portion of what he did, probably wreck me. But I think in a way, because Paul just had to get the gospel out. I mean, he just had to. And I think it almost in a way made him stronger because he knew God got him through it.
Right.
And God was with him. And he so felt powerfully about this that he wanted to have others to join in on this. So in a way, I think it made him stronger. Now, I don't know if that's what theologians say, but that's what I think.
Well, and I think part of Paul's strength is his transparency with his weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
That's a part of his strength. Just his honesty with how. I'm thinking of verse 3. He says, "I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling." I mean, think about that. This is the great apostle, and he says, "I came to you in weakness and great fear and trembling." So that's pretty secure in your faith, I guess, when you can be that open with a group of people you're teaching, that this is how I come to you. When I imagine Paul, when he first came into Corinth, he's just gone through these beatings and jail time and a mob chasing him out of town. And then the frustration of not connecting very well in Athens. Anyone in ministry knows those times when you think, am I doing anything really that's any good? And here Paul, with the weight of all this stuff on him, I just kind of envision this fellow coming into Corinth, not beaten down, but a little discouraged.
Yes. And it's my understanding that Corinth was pretty much a mess. I mean, they had all kinds of issues going on, and the church leaders were as bad as anybody. And I think Paul would have said, "Oh, why did I get into this?"
Just think about a state of Pharisee. I could have been something. Yeah, because, we're looking at all of this 2,000 years later, but Paul's in the midst of it.
Right.
And it couldn't have always felt like a lot of success.
Yes, that's right.
We look back in time with great appreciation on him, but boy, at the time, he had contemporaries that were undermining what he said and did. And everywhere he went, there was either rebellion or revival, it seems like, and sometimes both. So it took a special vessel. He had grit, he had a strong will, but it needed to be a person like that. So he has this resolve to come to Corinth and to preach I'm going to call it the simplicity of the gospel.
Yes.
Jesus and him crucified. And remember from earlier weeks that Paul said to the Greeks, this is foolishness; to the Jews, this message is a stumbling block; but to those who are called, it is the power of God. And it's almost as though I'm going to put out this basic, I'm going to call it like a Billy Graham message, this basic call, Jesus and him crucified, and just work with those that God stirs and has responded to the gospel. And it seemed to work. I mean, Corinth became his home for 2 years, and so the church got built up. But then, as you say, it would also be a thorn in his side because there was so much division, and we'll be talking about that in the weeks ahead. But so much in the flesh and selfishness and pettiness and all of those things that go where people gather together in anything, whether it's a church or a business. You worked in the state. I bet there was some of that going on there as well.
Oh, I could tell you stories. I do think, though, when Paul was in Athens and he got some, what I call it, he got some bites. There were some people who thought, well, maybe I want to hear more. Now, I don't know if they were just putting him off like some people do, but I often think that must have filled his heart with joy, just like I'm sure it does for pastors today. When you see that spark in somebody, that must have given him just lots of joy to know there were some people that he was reaching.
Yeah. Oh, it does. And it's sort of like, I don't know if you've ever been if you've ever played golf, but I'm a mediocre golfer. But almost every round I hit 2 or 3 really great shots, and that's enough to keep me coming back.
Yeah.
So sometimes in ministry you feel pretty mediocre, but there are enough of those genuine responses to the gospel that keep you coming back.
Yes. Those are the good days.
Those are the good days, and you're very thankful for them.
But we know the Lord, so every day is a good day.
It is, and the Lord's working even when you can't see it. You're planting seeds, and those seeds, wouldn't it be great if we could see what it's doing in someone's heart?
Oh.
But you can't.
Yes.
But something is happening, and it's like the man who's going to be leading us in Laredo, Texas next week, in Marshalltown, had no idea that this young Hispanic guy who came to Christ, at that time, I think he was just trying to eke out a living, and we just worked with him where he was. Who would have known that he would go on to become a missionary for a few decades and be leading us now? So someone who came to Christ under our ministry back in the 80s is now leading us. So who would have known it except the Holy Spirit?
Yes. What a joy.
It's gratifying. It's joyful. It's a pretty neat thing. It's humbling, probably most of all. And then he says, in verse 4, my message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. What do you think that means? A demonstration of the Spirit's power? Well,
clearly Paul knew the Holy Spirit was in him. And I think he knew that Spirit was at work with him. It wasn't his words or his stick-to-itiveness. It was the Spirit in him. And that's what I think he was trying to get across in most everything that he did. Hey, you got to have this Spirit. This is what this Spirit is all about. And that's what he means. It's not human. It's not anything that he conjured up by himself. It was the Spirit of the Lord in him.
Yeah, and the word demonstrate, another rendering of it is to prove. I proved, and I'm thinking in the midst of his weakness and his trembling and his fear, he demonstrated the Spirit. And I think about when someone is going through a difficult time, whether it's a physical illness or something else, and yet in the midst of that, they are faithful
Mm-hmm.
and they still find God's peace in the midst of it, though they're weak and they feel a little
Yes.
afraid. They're able to trust. They find God's strength. They move through it. They're a witness to others in the midst of this, whatever they're going through. That
Mm-hmm.
to me is a part of demonstrating. It proves the uh, the the genuineness of the faith that they profess.
Well, and Paul demonstrated that, I think, at least it always sticks out to me during the earthquake when he could have left, but he didn't. And I think if that's not a demonstration of one, your faith, and two, why the Lord sent you there, I think that's a powerful story.
It's a great story, and that's when they were in Philippi, and how many people would have just been out the door, and yet
Yes.
he had the wherewithal to know that jailer would, because you're responsible, so you're going to be executed if you lose prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he had the wherewithal to think this guy could do harm to himself, and he yells out and said, "Do yourself no harm." I mean, you're right. It's remarkable to have that kind of presence in the midst of that situation.
And what kind of testimony would that jailer give now?
Oh, yeah, he's telling everyone in Philippi.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, that's an awesome testimony and way to demonstrate. And then finally, verse 5. But with the demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. I wonder if that, in a way, is a reference to Athens or the culture within the Greeks of finding intellectualisms and reason and emphasizing wisdom. But it's not to rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. In the final analysis, it's God that we have to lean on and not our understanding of how all of this works.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, when you do think that it's your own power, that's what gets you into trouble. And if you can remember that this is a gift from God or God trying to teach me something, then you have such an avenue to grow your faith and to have peace that God wants you to have.
Yeah, yeah. Is Corinthians a letter that you have read a lot over the years, Nancy?
Well, I have, and we studied it in Bible Study Fellowship. And I think once you understand the background a little bit, and I don't claim to know all that much about the background, because I always get Paul's journeys and where he was when all mixed up. But I think when you understand the difficulty that he had in Corinth and the culture of Corinth and everything that was going on, and then you understand that Paul wanted to come forth with this simple message of who is Jesus and the resurrection. And it's profound because he deals with all of the stuff, and yet he gives us this simple message, which is what we have to talk about today.
Yeah, and I think that Corinth, and you can make a case that the city of Corinth and Paul's relationship with Corinth and the letters that he wrote to Corinth are as relatable to the 21st century as probably any of the letters he writes.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one of the things that I studied somewhere said that in his letter, what he was really talking about was relationships that build with the Lord in you and with each other. Mm-hmm. Because, we get to the love chapter where it's all about love. And I've always thought about that it's kind of a relationship letter.
Which is at the heart of what the gospel is. Reconciliation is our relationship being reconciled to God, and through that to each other.
Yes.
And even, I mean, when we think of God as triune, within the idea of Trinity is a social Godhead, God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And so our reconciliation to God is manifested through community.
Mm-hmm.
And we struggle with that because I think the working out of community at almost any level, Scott Peck used to talk about how community, he called it pseudo community first, where it's a surface level, everyone's nice. And then he said, but to get to real community, you almost always have to go through some level of conflict or tension or disagreement. He called it chaos. And he said at that point, a lot of people bail.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to go through that. They want to seek out pseudo community. But he said those who endure that, that's where you find the real community, where you work through all of that.
And I think that if you think of families, and oftentimes that the struggles you go through together make you a stronger unit. And I do think that's important. If you bail, you're not going to learn anything or grow or give the other person space or anything like that. So I think the struggles in all forms of life or all times of life are so important, even though we may not like them.
Even though we may not like them, that's right. Well, Nancy, as always, thank you. We're going to take a break next week from the online because I'll be in Texas and Julie will be sharing in person. So we'll just have 1 week on Wednesday that we're not meeting online, unless Julie decides to do a Zoom type meeting. I don't know. We haven't talked about that, but she won't probably do Corinthians anyway. And then in 2 weeks we'll resume with 1 Corinthians 2 and later in that chapter. So, okay, Nancy, thanks so much. I'm going to head out and lead the.
Good night.
Okay, blessings, everyone. God bless.
Bye.
Bye.